Welcome back to the Wednesday night Bible study. We are in the middle of a series. We began a series a couple weeks ago looking at chapter 11 of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, often called the Hall of Faith for that chapter. The first 10 chapters of Hebrews were for the author, and we don't really know exactly who it is. The author to acquaint the reader, which were Hebrew Christians who had been drifting back to Judaism, with the superiority and sufficiency of Jesus Christ. So the author is reacquainting the reader with the superiority and sufficiency of Jesus Christ as their Lord and High Priest. So then we get to chapter 11, that's the Hall of Faith. We see that with the suffering and backsliding going on, a focus on faith is needed. And that's what we get in Hebrews, starting at the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. So a couple of weeks ago, we looked deeper at what the author meant by faith. And you can catch that on Facebook or on the website. Now here he says, in verse 2, the author says the ancients were commended for their faith. And the author gave many examples of how the ancients, and these would be Old Testament men and women, demonstrated their faith. And last week, we began taking a look at this list of people, beginning with Abel. We read in Hebrews 11, verse 4, by faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, he still speaks, even though he is dead. So we then looked at Abel's story from Genesis 4. And here was a man who was faithful, obedient, and had a relationship with God. So you can catch all that in last week's installment. So the writer of Hebrews follows the faith of Abel with this in chapter 11, verse 5. Verse 5. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. So if we found out that there wasn't much to go on for Abel, we know very little of Enoch and his story from Scripture. There are books written from those times that some are attributed to Enoch or about Enoch, but Scripture-wise, we know very little. We do have from Scripture 4 verses in the book of Genesis. So let's look at those verses. And that's Genesis chapter 5, 21 through 24. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he became the father of Methuselah. And after he became the father of Methuselah, Enoch walked with God 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Altogether, Enoch lived 365 years. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. So there's an interesting contrast between Abel from last week and Enoch here. Abel died because of his faith. Enoch was spared from death because of it. I'd like you to think about this, just looking at these two examples. I picked these up somewhere, these wise words. Faith doesn't guarantee we will not suffer. Faith does guarantee that God will declare us righteous. All right, back to Enoch. So Enoch walked with God, and therefore God took him away. It's an error to think Enoch's faith was so strong that Enoch translated or moved his body himself. God is the decider. One minute Enoch was on earth, the next he's gone. Now, how was that done? Was it a poof? Was it an ascent upward? We don't know. I also wonder what would people who knew him think that he was no more. Now Enoch and Elijah, also in the Old Testament, are the only two human beings mentioned in the Bible who did not physically die. Now, of course, Jesus Christ could be on that list too. But of just regular men, Enoch and Elijah are the only two. Now I want to look at an interesting but subtle point in verse 22 here. Enoch is living for 65 years, has a son, and then walks with God. See how it says after he became the father of Methuselah, that's when he began walking with God. What motivated him? We don't know. Seeing his child, maybe the responsibility of raising him. I see that with a lot of parents. They tend to get a little bit closer with their relationship when they do become parents. So he walked with God, and that is what pleased God. All around him were the wicked. It was getting so bad that the flood would be happening in a couple of generations. Noah is the grandson of Enoch. So in a couple of generations, God floods the world. It is so wicked. I imagine, or I assume, that Enoch had a lot of temptation going on around him, but he continued to walk with God for 300 years. Now, we don't get a description of walking with God or more detail on that. The same was said of Noah, by the way, that he walked with God. What do you suppose it means, walking with God? Perhaps you think about prayer, worship, meditating on the Word. Now, for us, that is more for us because we have the Word. We have Scripture. Remember, there was no Bible for Enoch. He probably had more of a close relationship one-on-one with God. Obedience, maybe another thing with walking with God. Discipline, following God's will. All of those are walking with God, I believe. So that is all we really have on Enoch, a man who walked with God, and he was, by faith, he actually was no more. Now we come to a third person of faith in Hebrews 11, verse 7. By faith, Noah. Oh, we all heard of Noah, right? By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So I look at Noah's life as faith and works, faith and doing, obedience resulting in action. He too walked with God, as it says in verse 9. We'll see. But we get to see details of a way in which he acted in his faith. By the way, that's verse 9 of chapter 6, Genesis. That's what we'll get to soon. We get to see details of a way in which he acted in his faith in Genesis. Now, think about this. It's just 7 generations from Adam. The world had gone to heck in a handbasket. So in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. The Lord was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. So the Lord said, I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, men and animals, and creatures that move along the ground, and birds of the air, for I am grieved that I have made them. But Noah, as you see here, verse 8, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So there is something good in the world. One man, Noah. Now then we read about him, starting with verse 9. This is the account of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God, just as Enoch was told to have done. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It goes without saying he had a wife too. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight and was full of violence. God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Make a roof for it and finish the ark to within 18 inches of the top. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. Quite specific. So here you are, a man with a wife and 3 kids. You're Noah. You have a wife and 3 kids. You're over 500 years old. Genesis chapter 5:32 tells us that Noah was 500 when he began, having his 3 sons, and this is some time after that. Everyone around you is bad to the core except for you. You're a righteous man and have a great relationship with God. You have confidence, conviction, and trust in God. And now God drops this bombshell on you. He's going to destroy the world and all men on it. And he wants you to build an ark. How would you feel? How would you feel? But there's more. God's still talking in verse 17. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. So I'd be thinking my hearing had gone bad. Take 2 of every living creature, male and female. This is what in Hebrews 11:7 that we read, God warned Noah about things that were unseen. What was it that was not seen? It was the flood, I believe. There was not even rain happening right at the time. And not just a flood, but one that would destroy everything on the face of the earth. So there was this monstrosity called an ark. That was unseen too. It hadn't been built yet. But Noah had faith on things that were unseen. Ask yourself, what would I do? Maybe you might want to make excuses or maybe bargain with God. And what did Noah do? The very next verse tells us in verse 22, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. That's a person of faith, don't you think? Going back to Hebrews 11, verse 7. What about this holy fear the writer of Hebrews talks about? Let me bring that up. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, the flood hadn't happened yet, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. In holy fear. Noah's holy fear, found in Hebrews, doesn't mean he acted under the influence of being frightened. Instead, the Greek word means he acted cautiously, circumspectly, to reverence, stand in awe of. So that is the holy fear. Cautiousness, reverence, standing in awe. Remember, he's over 500 years old. He was 600 when the rain started, by the way. He didn't have power tools, and this was going to take years. Some say 40, some say 100, some say 120. Think about convincing the wife and the kids. I imagine, or I hope, that they respected him. He was such a man of integrity, but still. The next chapter begins with God talking with a week to go before the rains in chapter 7, Genesis 7. The Lord then said to Noah, go into the ark, you and your whole family, because I have found you. I have found you. That's singular. Not even his wife and kids are mentioned in this. Your whole family, because I have found you righteous in this generation. Take with you 7 of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 2 of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate, and also 7 of every kind of bird, male and female, to keep their various kinds alive throughout the earth. 7 days from now I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe from the face of the earth every living creature I have made. Perhaps now's the time to call it off. Let's just call this whole thing off. But how did Noah respond? And Noah did all that the Lord commanded him. There's that man of faith. That's a person of faith. So you know the story. Rains come for 40 days and 40 nights as promised. Now, one more thing to address from the Hebrews writer in the second half of chapter 11, verse 7. Hebrews 11:7, the second half. By his faith, he condemned the world By his faith, Noah condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. What does he mean? By his faith, he, Noah, condemned the world. I look at this as God told Noah the ark was intended to save him and his family, no one else. He was not instructed to save as many as he could. Now, I don't want to get bogged down here, but I find this very interesting that in 2 Peter, looking at 2 Peter chapter 2, we run across this. This is Peter. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons to be held for judgment, and if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. So Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and then the 7 others would be his wife and kids and their wives. So he condemned the world and was also a preacher of righteousness. I did not know that. It's not mentioned in his story in the Genesis, but it is brought up by Peter. A scholar named Diffenbaugh wrote, "We should be careful not to think of Noah as an evangelist. His message was one that was dramatically acted out as he built the ark for so many years." So maybe his message was by example. No doubt Noah warned those whose curiosity prompted them to take a look at his ark close up, but he was far too busy building it to do much else. Noah was not called to save that generation, but to condemn it, according to Diffenbaugh, and according to what Peter is saying. So author may not have taken into account the fact that he could have preached the first 500 years, this Bob Diffenbaugh. We don't know if he was a preacher, as we know what a preacher means. But let's assume he didn't. And if he was, he wasn't very successful anyway, because he never converted anyone. But his very persistence was in a way preaching. He was testifying to God and God's sovereignty. But also his faith, his righteous living, his walking with God, and as a consequence, his being saved by God, was testimony that everyone else in the world's lack of faith, lack of righteousness, failure to walk with God was their condemnation. So, by his faith, he condemned the world. After the flood, he lived another 350 years, dying at 950 years. You can see that in Genesis chapter 11, verse 7. That gave him a lot of years to continue his walk and express his thanks to God. We're going to continue on with some other ancients or men and women from the Old Testament next week. In the meantime, take care, and may the Lord be with you.